A lot has changed since we were last here. I would guess that they are holding their test subjects in the large hall. This means that we have to walk through the whole complex, but without anyone discovering us. That will prove difficult. Xaver surveyed the entire building and then rested his gaze anxiously on the entrance. These soldiers don't look friendly either. They won't just let us walk in. As he finished speaking, Cheyenne rose from her crouching position and ran back to the horses. From her saddlebag she grabbed the black white belt and put it on. Then she took the unfoldable bow and attached it to the sling provided for this purpose, which the girl had specifically sewn on, so she did not have to hold the combat tool in her hand all the time, but could still have it with her. Cheyenne went back to Xaver. He also had a belt and had already strapped it on. Just like herself, he also sewed on a fastening option for his old scratched sword. She remembered both sitting at his mother's kitchen table and doing their best to turn the simple belts into real weapon belts. It had taken a long time before the snares could actually hold their weapons instead of letting them fall through. But when it actually worked out, the friends had been very proud and happy about it. To this day, the homemade battle belts have served their purpose, and there were no signs that the snares would break or go off. "What are you up to?" Xaver watched his friend open the bow and aim in the direction of the soldiers. "I distract them so we can get to this front gate unnoticed. Or do you want to go to them and ask them if they mind if we go in there for a moment and deprive them of 2 test subjects?" Without taking her eyes off the intended goal, Cheyenne teased her companion with the last sentence he had also said to her a few minutes ago and waited for his answer. However, he didn't say anything, and she took it as a no. She concentrated as best as her current situation allowed and shot the black arrow into the grass a few meters away from the entrance. The spot was just so in the glow of the white float lamp, so that the knights had to take a look to be able to see more precisely. The friends hoped that the 3 guards had seen the arrow, because the air was pouring far too loudly on the metal building complex to hear the rupture of the air during flight or the impact of the dark object. The knights actually seemed to have noticed something. It looked like they were discussing what to do. However, they did not seem to consider it important enough to leave their post. Adukas glanced briefly in the direction where the 2 friends were squatting behind the rock, and then trotted off in the direction where the arrow had fallen. There he barked, attracting the full attention of the guards. 2 of them slowly moved towards him to look. One pulled his sword out of his scabbard and held it menacingly aside, ready to attack. The other walked a little behind his colleague and rested his hand on the hilt of the sword. Cheyenne didn't think twice and started running. The grass was wet and slippery, and she almost fell. Xaver, who was puzzled and annoyed by his friend's hasty, unreasonable and haphazard action, had no choice but to run after her. She ran straight towards the entrance of the building, hoping that the 3rd guard standing slightly to the side would continue to observe his colleagues and not notice them. But when she tried to open the gate, but it didn't move an inch, the knight turned around and discovered her. He approached Cheyenne and drew his sword. The guard was quite tall, and his armor shone silver and white in the bright glow of the float lamp. He growled like a dog, and the girl stared at him. Her heart was racing, and she was terrified. She gasped, saw that she could not avoid him and ran away, and turned to the front gate. Desperately she tried to open it. The only way to escape the night was to escape through this gate into the interior of the building. But the huge metal door just wouldn't open, and Cheyenne felt the man in armor grab her by the waist. Then he gripped her body at this point with one arm. With the other hand, he held his sword to her neck and pressed so that she could no longer breathe. Cheyenne was shaking and gasping for breath, but was not allowed to move too much, because then this sharp sword would cut into her neck. She felt stabbing pain and the strong grip of the night, which also affected her. She would not be able to stand under these conditions for long, but she had to persevere. The sharp cold blade was slowly moved by the guard, and she felt blood flowing down her neck. She felt the warm breath of her enemy on the back of her neck as he began to laugh softly. Cheyenne desperately tried to remove the sword from her neck with her hands, with the result that she slit her hands and the blade cut even more. Nevertheless, she saw this method as the only chance to free herself and kept trying. The pain was unbearable, and she would have liked to cry out loudly, but the only thing her voice gave was a few hoarse, gurgling sounds. Cheyenne felt her heartbeat pounding in her throat, and her vision became blurred. She felt weak. "Let go of me! I can't give up now! I have to hold on, and I have to save them!" Her legs were about to give up when she suddenly heard a muffled noise and the night let go of her. Cheyenne fell to her knees and gasped for air. Her eyes teared up, her heart threatened to burst. She was shaking like crazy, and the wound on her neck hurt, but somehow the guard had let go of her. She turned around and saw Xaver standing with his sword behind the knight, now lying on the ground. The man in armor was not dead, for he was still breathing and moaning a little. He just seemed to be unconscious. The girl could see that her friend was upset, but his concern still outweighed considerably. He hurried towards her and knelt down to Cheyenne. "Why didn't you tell me when you were going to run? This could have ended pretty badly. How can you be so unreasonable?" Without finishing the sentence, he sighed and closed his eyes briefly to collect himself and clear his head. "Are you okay? This cut must hurt a lot, huh? I'm sorry I couldn't free you faster, but until I realized you started running and I could follow you a few seconds past. And you can really run fast, you know that?" His reaction was understandable. After all, he had been worried about Cheyenne. "If he hadn't been here now, then a guy would have killed me for sure." "Xaver, thank you." Slowly she could breathe normally again and looked at her friend remorsefully. His stern and worried look relaxed a little, and then he looked at her wound. The girl carefully placed her hand on it and flinched in pain. Then she looked at her fingers and examined the blood that was now stuck on them. "I'm fine, don't worry. Think about how we can quickly open this door. It doesn't move an inch. And the other 2 knights will be right back." Cheyenne stroked the floor with her bloody hand to wipe off the red liquid and flinched again. I had forgotten that I cut my hands on the guardian's sword." The damp soil brought dirt into her wounds, and this hurt her. The girl stood up staggeringly and tried to find her balance. It wasn't long before she could stand safely again. The rain was still falling relentlessly from the sky. Cheyenne opened her palms and let the cold water patter on them. It burned like crazy, but at least it cleaned her wounds. Meanwhile, Xaver went to the fainted knight and searched his armor. Cheyenne watched his actions curiously. "What are you doing?" Without turning to her for answering, he searched further and finally found a metal bracelet on the knight's wrist with a round, shiny plate on it. He stood up and examined it more closely. "Do you see the device next to the entrance gate?" Xaver moved towards it, and Cheyenne's gaze followed him. "I don't think the door will open until we scan this red chip there." The girl tilted her head, hoping he would be right. Why didn't I notice that?" Xaver's friend admired his quick comprehension. The boy scanned the chip without any problems, and a beep sounded. It was almost as if he had done this many times before. The huge metal door opened, and the 2 friends entered. As soon as they passed through the gate, it closed again. At just the right time, because Cheyenne could hear the 2 guards coming back. She sighed in relief, as did Xaver. That was really close. The friends looked around. In front of them stretched a long, large tunnel, the bottom of which was made of glass. Underneath, white flashes flashed and illuminated the way. There were no knights to be seen, far and wide, and so the 2 started moving. As they walked across the glass floor, Cheyenne noticed that the door at the end of the tunnel had also a scanning device. "Xaver, how did you figure out how to open the door so quickly? That was really impressive." He looked embarrassed to the side and blushed a little. Oh, that was nothing. I think in situations like right now I can think very quickly, you know. I didn't deserve the praise. He smiled at Cheyenne. Yes, you deserve it. I hope I can think as fast in the future. She wanted to return his smile, but she couldn't, given the situation. Instead, she sighed and walked faster. Xaver also opened the door at the end of the tunnel and they entered a huge hall. The walls were made of metal, illuminated by countless white lamps. In the middle of the room there was an elevator, which probably took people to the higher 2 floors above the heads of their friends. Cheyenne had never seen so many doors in a room before. They were all the same except for one, a large gate behind the elevator. On it something was written in large letters. Research. Human and animal research. Sectors A to G. Comply with safety measures. That's where we have to go, Cheyenne whispered. She did not dare to speak aloud in this great hall. Her words would echo quite loudly from the metal walls, and surely someone would hear that. However, the 2 friends were currently the only ones in the large room. How curious. I had actually thought it was teeming with researchers and guards. Xaver also spoke very quietly and let his gaze wander around worriedly. Maybe they'll all sleep, who knows? But we don't have time to think about it. Come on, we have to hurry up and go to the research area. With that, Cheyenne ended her friend's thinking phase and moved on, holding Xaver's hand, dragging him along behind her. It's pretty cold in here. Does this white light not warm up? Chroma's shine would light up the room in no time. Suddenly, a door was heard above their heads. It was opened directly above them. Fortunately, the 2 friends stood under the higher floor and would not be discovered if they were quiet. As if rooted, the 2 stopped and listened to the footsteps. A second door opened and closed again. Then calm returned to the great hall. Cheyenne and Xaver breathed a sigh of relief and were glad they were walking along the edge of the hall. Without talking, they crept to the large metal door that led into the research complex. Xaver opened the gate and they entered the next hall. They were presented with a sight of horror. The room was considerably larger than the previous one and had several floors. On each of the levels there were candles that made up the majority of the complex. In them were half-naked, emaciated people, here and there even some without any robe. Some cried desperately for help, cried in their pain, shook the cages, and some just sat apathetically in a corner staring in front of them. On the top levels were children calling for their mothers. On the lowest level where Cheyenne and Xaver were, there were not only people in the enclosures, but also animals and even creatures that looked like a mixture of both. The monsters growled, hissed, and tried to break open the cages, but each attempt was punished with an electric shock. In the middle of the hall was the only area, illuminated by white lamps. It stretched over all floors and was divided into many rooms. Through windows you could see the procedure in it. People who were forcibly tied to couches and chairs, who were operated on, or who were instilled with something. They wriggled and whirled wildly, but in vain. They did not manage to free themselves. Animals could also be seen in the rooms. They shared the fate of the people. This area had to be the research center, and another metal door seemed to be the entrance for it. The smell of medicine and blood was in the air. Only now did Cheyenne notice the different letters on the stone floor. Presumably, they marked the different sectors, as was previously written on the large metal door, through which they had entered this very room. The 2 friends stood there stunned. They had not expected so much cruelty. Xaver looked down and closed his eyes. This is terrible. He could not say more and fell back into speechlessness. Cheyenne was breathing quickly and had started shaking again. She ran off again without thinking, desperately searching every lower level cage with her eyes. Instead of stopping her, her friend accompanied her. He seemed to sense that her worries about her grandparents had just increased drastically. Between the enclosures of the different sectors, there were corridors that led outside. I can see them anywhere. They're not here. What am I doing now? What am I doing? I have to find them. I just have to find them. Several times now she had walked past the cages of the lower level, but could not detect her grandparents. She would have liked to call out loud for them, but she didn't dare. Knights would come immediately and discover the friends, and the girl did not want to get Xaver into more trouble than she already did. Cheyenne stopped. She didn't even try to hold back her tears and let them roll down her cheeks. Her friend caught up with her and took her in his arms. For a few seconds they stood tightly embraced.